Hey everyone, today we're ranking the characters least to most evil. This time we're also including the cosmetic characters into this list. We're going to be judging this primarily by looking at the characters before the realm and before they were completely corrupted by the entity. However, we also will take into account their reactions to the realm too. We have 5 tiers: actually good, bad but redeemable, bad but irredeemable, simply evil, and Evil Incarnate. Starting off with actually good, Spirit is a character who never actually caused any death prior to her time in the realm. The most violent thing she does is beat up her bullies in self-defense. Otherwise, she's a fairly normal student, working a part-time job and studying, all until her father attacks her and her mother. In her dying moments, she's convinced to join the entity, fueled by the rage toward her father's actions. Artist is another character who hasn't actually killed anyone. Her life was destroyed by the presence of the entity in it, initially causing the death of her younger brother and later her friends. The entity seems to have a lot of control over what happens in her life, appearing throughout it in the form of crows. In her final moments, after losing her hands, tongue, and friends, she gives in to the entity, a tragic character who really did nothing wrong. Hag is a character who did act foolishly, but this doesn't necessarily make her bad because of that. Lisa used the hexes for things such as her schoolwork to help her get ahead. Even after the accidental death of her friend, seemingly actually from the hexes, Lisa still continues to use them, it seems. She ends up captured in the swamp by the villagers. In her final moments, Lisa scratches out a symbol, but I don't think she necessarily thought it would summon the entity, but that is what happened. And with that being her only out, she decided to take it. Twins are debatably some of the most innocent characters, despite likely being fairly violent in their past. From birth, they were hunted down due to them being conjoined. Their mother was burned, and they were left to survive alone in the woods, with Victor dying soon after. Charlotte lives most of her life alone and in fear, all because of something she couldn't control. In the realm even, she probably only does what the entity says because it gave her Victor back and allows her to have a safe place away from being constantly chased. The Ferryman is a character that I would classify as relatively neutral and pretty much innocent, with him simply fulfilling the role of taking people across the River Styx in the underworld. It's just a job and the people are already dead. And if anything, in the myths, he appears to find it to be monotonous. It's not like he enjoys it. I would say he isn't necessarily bad, but he's also not clearly good either, but a relatively neutral entity. In this case, I think he's kind of between actually good and bad but redeemable. On to bad but redeemable. Wraith is another morally questionable character. It's hard to judge Philip, as many of his actions could be considered as pretty bad. However, he's often in quite extreme situations that would probably break a lot of people. In his early life, he's caught in the middle of a civil war, his parents dead, grandparents dead, and left wandering until he is found by a woman named Fernanya, who is soon also killed in a really horrible way too by soldiers. In a rage, Philip burns the soldiers that did it. Later on, when he goes to Autohaven Wreckers, and he simply works there, he later finds out he helped to crush a bunch of people who he didn't realize were in the cars that he was crushing. This leads him into a rage again, and he kills his evil boss, Azarov. Plague is a character who is definitely more morally questionable than some of the others on the lower end. While she does seem to want to act in the better interests of her people, it is also likely that she sacrificed a decent amount of people to her god, which was ultimately the entity. Bear in mind too that all it took to convince her was a single whisper, and after this she pretty brutally took out her father figure and mentor, which is a pretty serious action for just a whisper. While she isn't intentionally evil or anything, she definitely does act morally questionable, even for her time period. Demogorgon is a creature that follows orders, it seems. We do know that Demogorgons aren't inherently evil creatures, with Dustin raising one and actually forming a bond with it. However, they're for the most part under the control of another greater being at any given point, which sort of makes it hard to judge. Their anatomy is also sort of built for destruction, so for me they're around here. Armored Titan I wasn't too sure on, but I used some comments from another video, so hopefully it's more accurate this time. Thanks to those comments. Although this Titan has done some killing, it didn't seem to enjoy much of it despite that smile it has. It may have caused a lot of death, but it seems the person within isn't entirely bad or lost of humanity, and feels a lot of guilt for what they've done. So I think bad, but ultimately redeemable. William Birkin is sort of a case of being a bit brainwashed by Umbrella, but also being too ambitious with his creation of the G-Virus, which is what he later takes after being shot, and it transforms him into the monster we see in the realm. How much humanity is left in Birkin is kind of unclear. It doesn't seem like much. I would most definitely classify him as bad, especially with all the subsequent damage the G-Virus causes within the universe. In terms of redemption, I think maybe with his clear resistance of the virus and his realization of his mistake, he could be considered redeemable. Trapper is a really strange character, because on one hand he's known as the guy who caused the worst massacre in modern human history. However, on the other, he actively rejects and fights the entity. He hates his father one moment, then looks up to him and follows his lead the next. He's a very confused guy. In the old Benedict Baker entry that got removed, he was named the Miserable Smiling Killer. Despite his mask always smiling, he has a miserable expression beneath, which I think sums him up very well. Whilst he is undeniably bad, therefore, I think he does have potential for redemption, or at least some humanity left. He's definitely teetering on the edge of this due to his horrendous deeds, but it's there, I think. Bad but irredeemable. The Xenomorphs I'm going to place together, Xenomorph and Xenomorph Queen, as they have the same goal of survival. They'll get rid of anything in their path and do so with little care, pretty mercilessly. I also don't think they necessarily do it with the idea of evil in mind, but then again, kind of just cutting through anything in your way without a thought is a pretty terrible thing to do. It's in their nature though, but I still think they're kind of deserving of this spot. Nemesis is an Umbrella-made BOW, created for the purpose of destruction, adapting to its environment no matter what, and being an extremely lethal pursuer. Nemesis was built to cause violence, and with the little agency he has, he does seem to play with his food somewhat and enjoy what he does, making him pretty evil. It's a manufactured evil, but evil nonetheless. Jabberwock I don't really know what to think of, because all I'm really going off of is a short and rather confusing poem, which doesn't even tell us much about the motives of the Jabberwock. Sure, it's a scary looking creature, but that doesn't really mean it's evil. It could be acting off of instinct, which I would argue isn't really evil, but definitely leaning onto the bad side of things. I guess it would be irredeemable because it's like a monster. You probably can't change its mind and negotiate with it, as it were. Executioner is a character where it's not too clear how to define his intentions. He's created from the mind of James Sunderland after all, but in DBD has become sort of a general dispenser of punishment and pain for those with guilty consciences. In the realm, a lot of the survivors may carry some level of guilt, but not to the level that they deserve to be here. So Pyramid Head's actions I would largely classify as being bad leaning, even if he's just doing it for a job. It's still a morally bad job, even though it can be proven to help people such as James to move on. And I would say he's irredeemable because, well, he was literally created for this purpose. It's not like he's going to change. HUNK is a mercenary who worked for Umbrella. He's known as the Grim Reaper, and basically just destroys everything in his path, completing his work ultimately for a paycheck. He doesn't care about life, but simply completing his mission. Warhammer Titan is another one I don't know much about, so thanks to the comments again. In this case, it seems they are mostly concerned about survival, so I'm going to place them in a similar spot to the Xenomorphs, where it's a case of killing in order to survive, or by nature, and not really by intent. It still makes them somewhat bad for the chaos they cause, but not quite as evil as some others. Legion as a group is responsible for a lot of the chaos within Ormond, and the death of a store worker who they later buried up Mount Ormond, all the members sort of having varying degrees of bad intentions. It also sort of depends if we take into account the cosmetics. Overall though, Joey is probably the least bad of the lot, followed by Susie, then Julie and Frank together, I would say. They're the ringleaders and have a twisted interest in violence and killers and stuff like that, desiring to become that way. Billy is a character with a very tragic upbringing, and part of the tragedy is that it ends up in him becoming the monster he was raised as. He ends up enjoying violence and the destruction he causes. He definitely has humanity within him still, but I think now he is beyond redemption, sadly. Minotaur is another fairly complex character despite initially appearing as just another monster. The Minotaur becomes what it is mostly from its surroundings and upbringing. It becomes a monster as a result of being locked in the dark confines of the labyrinth and fed only people. The Minotaur is actually fairly similar to Billy, I think, where due to the conditions of how he was raised, he's become a monster, which is really sad, and is also probably at the point where he's beyond redemption. Bubba is a very confused person who does much of what he does out of fear, out of the realm of his family and in the realm from the entity, but that doesn't really excuse the fact that he kind of chillies people and wears them. It's not the best. He doesn't have an intention to be evil, I suppose, but his actions are undeniably evil. I also don't think there's a chance of redemption here, with his upbringing being too deeply rooted within him. Quite similar to Billy, he was sort of raised as a monster, and so he's become one. Huntress is another character who doesn't seem to ever have intention to act evil, but she undeniably does evil actions like raiding and destroying whole villages. For times when soldiers enter her wood, it could maybe be viewed a bit differently, but for these innocent people, it's definitely different, especially with how she steals the girls and is unable to provide for them properly. The whole thing is pretty messed up. Baba Yaga is sort of similar to Huntress in that it causes a bunch of chaos out in the forest. It's also said to do some good deeds too, but for the most part it shares very similar features to Huntress. Just because it spares some, that doesn't mean it's good or makes up for the many people it's deceived and killed. Mordeo is sort of a similar deal as these other two. It's just out in the woods and attacks those who eat people or who enter into their territory. It's also a demon, and so it's not like it's really built to be good in the first place. Whilst it may not attack everyone, it's also built for a fairly sinister purpose, and therefore I'll place it around here too. Birch is sort of acting in a similar way in the realm too, where it's more of a territory thing seemingly, and down to the survivors disturbing the symbols. Whilst it isn't maybe being intentionally evil again, it is still causing harm, both in and out of the realm, having some extreme reactions to bad people who maybe deserve punishment, but not quite death. Pig is a character who does a lot of bad stuff. She follows Jigsaw with the games and rigs a lot of the traps too so they're inescapable. While she may not be evil, she's definitely not good. I do think there was potential redemption if she hadn't died, but it's sort of hard to tell. In the realm, she does willingly agree with the trials, and even has this deluded idea still that it's all Jigsaw's plan. I do think there was a time Amanda could have been redeemed, but I also think at this point she's past that. Sadako is a character who validly has a lot of anger after being shoved down a well and left to rot for decades. However, it isn't too fair that she takes her anger out on people who really have no part in her being there. She causes lots of unnecessary death by projecting her tape. It's ultimately a pretty evil action considering she herself was a victim of a pretty horrendous thing too. It just sort of makes it worse. Deathslinger is a case of a character who had potential to live an honest life, and even have some redemption, but unfortunately he gave in to his anger. Although his anger is justified with his creations being stolen and sold on, his reaction to these things is not, with him nearly killing his boss at the time, Henry Bayshore. This leads Caleb down a path of anger, which eventually ends with him becoming a famed bounty hunter and causing a lot of chaos and harm. When he looks back at what he could have been, he seems to reject it in order to enter the realm, so I think he's too far gone really. There's humanity within him I think, but he's beyond the point of redemption. Tiffany as a character is definitely bad. She gets a clear thrill out of killing and seeing Chucky do it too. She often even suggests more twisted and messed up ways to do stuff, revealing a pretty dark side to her. In the later films, Tiffany has moments of wanting to stop her violent ways, calling it an addiction and hoping to one day stop it, but it never really works out. Ultimately, she's around here, I think. Nurse is a complicated case. She's left widowed and has to take on a job at Crotus Pren Asylum in order to get by. Over the next 2 decades, the days of physical and mental strain and abuse eventually lead her to snap after a patient convinces her that the other patients of the asylum deserve to die. One night, she wipes everyone out and comes out the end seemingly with a lost mind. Her life does seem potentially manipulated by the entity too. too. Undeniably though, she does some really terrible stuff, and with really bad motives for that stuff too, making her misguided and tragic, but undeniably still bad. Blight is a hard one to judge because he never seems to have bad intentions necessarily, but despite this he does cause hundreds of deaths, which is a little hard to ignore. This happened after he tried to create a serum to enhance soldiers on the battlefield. This whole event, however, does seem to drive him crazy, partly through guilt, and it leads him to seeking out other dimensions and finding the realm. I do think he's bad, and I think now too he's definitely in a spot with very little humanity or potential for redemption, as he's completely warped his own mind through experimentation. Simply evil. The Look-See is an evil entity similar to something like Pyramid Head. It targets those who have guilt and takes a piece of them if they fail to let go. It's responsible for lots of people dying, however, and it doesn't seem overly fair to force people to move on, making it pretty bad, I think. It's got a grin on its face the whole time and seems to enjoy its actions too. Krampus is a pretty evil creature that punishes people that have been bad, occasionally just by smacking them, but sometimes by taking them to the underworld in their basket. It's another case of it sort of just being their job, as it were, but it's still pretty immoral nonetheless, and has quite extreme punishments. Singularity is a character that's a bit hard to judge because most of what changes him is the crystal he touches. It's only after the crystal touch that Hux begins calling humans worms and seeking to destroy all of them. However, it could be argued that he is the crystal essentially, with him not being conscious in the same way to a human prior to touching it. Therefore he's pretty irredeemable, I would say, with his killing of the Devaka crew, with little care for them at all. Clown is a character that from a young age was shown to be pretty sadistic, beginning with his killing of birds, keeping trophies with their feathers. This later scaled over time to people and fingers. He's gluttonous, sloppy, and enjoys violence and playing with victims. He is most definitely evil, and without a doubt irredeemable. Trickster is a pretty terrible character who became initially inspired to become a killer after hearing his bandmates burning in a fire, finding their screams enticing. From here he then used his power, wealth, and influence to allow him to continue killing and getting away with it, even putting victim screams into his songs, which is really disturbing. Ultimately, Trickster is a monster. Ghostface is an evil guy worthy of no redemption, and he also doesn't want it seemingly. Ghostface is a meticulous stalking killer who follows victims and tracks their routines, taking photos and stealing things before going in for the kill. He then brazenly writes about his own deeds in the paper, accompanied by pictures he often took himself. We can presume aside his terrorizing of Roseville, he also did this in multiple other towns too, making him pretty terrifying and definitely evil. Skull Merchant is a pretty evil character who manages to build her wealth on the back of the blood she spills, taking over companies by killing the CEOs and stuff like that. She clearly also gets enjoyment from it, both taking the company and scrapping it, but also hunting down the people. It's not too clear how many times she's done this, but it seems to be quite a few, with her even having her own traveling base and tracking systems set up specifically for this. Knight is a pretty terrible guy. He starts out having a rough upbringing, being captured by the Guardia Campania, but later he essentially becomes a mercenary who then goes on to kill a bunch of people. In the final moments before he gets taken into the realm, a town of people rises up against him because he's that evil. This is followed by lots of slaughtering. Not a good guy. Draugr Knight is essentially just Knight, but undead and more angry, and more likely to cause chaos. It's more than likely a Draugr, and these things are basically horrible zombie type things that take the bodies of bad people, and they enjoy chaos and destruction. So pretty bad, especially when placed onto the Knight. It's like Knight but worse. Wesker is a pretty bad guy. He initially worked for Umbrella, before later moving on to his own endeavours, forming the Ouroboros virus and planning to release it upon the world, which would have likely wiped out most of humanity. He frequently manipulates and betrays people, and he's just generally not a good guy, seeing himself as a superior being because of his altered biology. Cenobite and Chatterer are in part part demons to some and angels to others. The both of them are pretty bad, using lots of messed up methods to bring about pain, and also not always being too truthful to their word. They primarily care about their own goals, and achieving them, causing pain and pleasure, and so the realm seems to benefit them. They are, for the most part, evil beings. Naughty Bear is a tough one to judge because in the universe he's from, stuffed bears seem to make up the main populace, but if we equate these bears to be people for us, this makes him pretty terrible. He kills a lot of different bears, and all because he wasn't invited to a birthday party, which isn't really a good motive for doing that. Naughty clearly enjoys the violence too, with his devious grin. Oni is a character with a fairly indefensible background, having potentially the highest kill count out of any of the characters, being at minimum in the hundreds. Whether or not what he thought was doing was right doesn't excuse any number close to that. This number includes his own father and even many innocent people trying to defend their town. Kazan has shown to have a calmer and kinder side, especially for his son, but in all other areas this guy is a monster. Chucky is about as evil as you can get. He relentlessly kills and openly laughs whilst doing so, and have this reputation. He's also completely okay with doing this to literally anyone. I mean, for 3 of the films he's just chasing Andy for most of them, which is really messed up. He's a terrible person who causes a bunch of suffering and pain. Evil Incarnate. Doctor is one of the evilest characters in the game, and whilst he doesn't literally embody evil like some other characters do on this list, he's still that bad that I think the title applies to him regardless. His use of shock therapy and testing it on people for years within Larry's is really messed up, especially with how much he clearly enjoys it. This on top of the countless people he killed when he wiped Larry's out before being taken. This guy is a complete monster. Freddy is another case of this where he's such a horrible monster with his abuse and killings that he is up here for that title of Evil Incarnate. He's an irredeemable monster who has done so many dreadful things. He was so evil after all, he became a literal demon too. Myers is Evil Incarnate in the more literal sense, being described as purely and simply evil by Dr. Loomis. He clearly possesses some supernatural qualities, and in some canons is even possessed by a demon. Myers' only goal is to kill, and that is it. He doesn't seem to do it with much thought behind it, he just does it, with there even being moments of clear enjoyment that he has for it. Dredge is the closest thing in the game, I think, to just looking like the embodiment of evil. It's this dark cloud with different limbs and meat masses poking from it. It has nothing discernibly human about it, and all it wants is to consume more. It was summoned originally by the suppressed dark thoughts of the Garden of Joy community, and seems to bring darkness and fog wherever it goes. A creature of evil, pure and simple. Well, that's gonna do it. I do hope you enjoyed, and let me know your thoughts too down below. Thanks, and goodbye.